Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today I'm really excited. We're continuing on with my Shroud Solo Show panel review sessions. So this is going to be part 2, and I'm joined by the regular fellows. We have let's start with Bob Rucker. He's right there to my left. So hey Bob, welcome back. And we have Hugh Farey, the Shroud Skeptic.
Hi there.
Hey Hugh. And we have a couple new people joining us for the panel reviews, but Joe Marino, you've been on the show before, so welcome back.
Thank you.
And somebody who's never been on the show before, Mark Guscin. Hey, Mark.
Hi, nice to be here.
Awesome. And did I pronounce the last name properly, or did I mess that up? Or
I'm just used to having it pronounced in so many different ways. It's a Polish surname, okay? It should be Guscin, but I'm used to it being Guscin or whatever. I just hear something and think that must be me.
Gotcha. No problem. I'll do my best. Believe it or not,
okay.
my last name's Glover, but people always pronounce it Glover, so I can relate a bit. But all right, cool. So basically, in part 1, we kind of covered my notion about the irrelevancy of the dating. As well, we had a discussion on the 1988 carbon-14 dating. And then we looked at the Hungarian Prey Codex. In today's episode, I'm focusing on 3 new topics that I covered in my solo shows. So firstly, the 1389 memo, D'Arcis Memorandum, as well as the medieval documents surrounding that. Then we're going to be getting into the art history and numismatic coins argument that I covered in my Shroud Solo Show Part 2. And finally, obviously Mark's here, so we're going to be covering the Sudarium of Oviedo. But just before we get into the topics, obviously Mark's new to the show, so I want to first turn it to you. And you want to kind of just introduce the audience as to who you are, how you got involved in Shroud studies, and if you don't mind, a bit about your faith journey as well.
Yeah, the first time I even heard about the Shroud was I was still at high school. And one day they took us to a cinema to see David Rolfe's first documentary, must have been 1978, okay, The Silent Witness. And I just thought, wow, that's interesting topic. Initially, nothing to do with belief or anything like that. It's just, look, there's so much in there. And then I mean, my studies and my livelihood, I'm specialist, I suppose you could say, in ancient languages. That's what I did my degree in and my PhD, Latin, medieval Greek, classical Greek, Hebrew, all of that. I work a lot with manuscripts and it just sort of, there's so much controversy and so much debate about the history of the Shroud, apart from the scientific part of it. That's where I sort of really got involved in it, from the historical side, historical point of view. That's what my speciality is, and that's where I think I can make contributions. I think it's important to stay within your field of studies. I can say what other people have said about science, about image reproduction, about photography. I can understand it. I don't have any theories because that's not my field. And I think that's one of the dangers that you often see in Shroud studies is people talking and saying that they're doing research and coming to conclusions about things outside their field. Now, when that happens with history, which we can talk about a bit later, there's a lot of people who think, oh, I read a book, so I'm a historian. History is much more complicated than that. But well, that's me basically.
Awesome. Well, yeah, welcome to the show. You're a welcome addition to the Shroud Wars. So, all right, cool. So, one thing I want to do just before we get into today's topics, I promised Joe Marino, because in part 1 we kind of covered again the carbon-14 dating, but obviously.
Could I just say,
sure,
one little interruption here? I haven't had the chance to congratulate in public Joe for his huge, gigantic, enormous book on the carbon dating. It's fantastic. And I did in the Shroud newsletter when I was editing that, but I've never told him face to face virtually. Joe, that was a work of art, that book. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Mark, do you agree with, are you like the invisible reweave hypothesis? Is that what you?
I didn't at first, but the more I read about it and the more I looked into it, totally convinced me. Thanks a lot to Joe and his work and Ray Rod. Well, all the science involved in that. It makes a lot of sense.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, as I was saying, on the last show when we covered it, Joe wasn't able to make it on that show.
Lost the sound. Okay.
Joe wasn't able to make it on that show, and obviously, you know, I kind of go for Bob Rucker's hypothesis. So none of us really represented the invisible reweave. So I want to turn it to Joe and give you like 10 minutes or so to kind of give your case about the invisible reweave, or say whatever you want to say about that show. So yeah, go ahead and take it away for the next 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll need that long. You know, I think first of all, I agree with Mark's point about, you know, going outside your field of expertise. I just kind of see myself as a generalist. I'm not a textile expert. I'm not a scientist, but you know, what I think I am pretty good at is connecting dots, because I've read everything in the English language, and because of the wonderful Google Translate, I can now pretty much understand a lot of the foreign stuff. Boy, the Google Translate is so much better than the software in the 90s, which was practically useless for language translation. But you know, I've read everything, and as far as the invisible reeve goes, you know, I presented a paper in 2019 at Ancaster, and had a lot of time to do it, and gave some kind of superfluous background to it. But I'm actually working right now on an update of the paper, and I possibly may present it virtually. There's going to be a conference, a 40th anniversary of the Mexican Shroud Center, I believe. They've contacted me, and I'm hoping I might be able to present the update. And rather than going into a lot of specifics right here, I mean, you know, 10 minutes probably wouldn't be enough if I started doing that. I would just say that I've accumulated a lot of evidence and connected a lot of dots, where I've got a lot of experts, including textile experts and scientists, and a lot of individuals who are independently suggesting that the cloth was manipulated. And I would point out that really Ray Rogers was really the only person in the world capable of accurately looking at our theory, because he had leftover samples from the main part of the shroud from 1978, and he also had some of the Reyes samples, which were right next to the C14 sample. And then later he actually got a C14 sample and found that the Reyes samples and the C14 samples had the same characteristics, and he found the splice and the dye and the gum and the stuff. And it's like a lot of independent people are suggesting that that corner was manipulated, and there is the technique known as the French invisible reweave. There's several types of that weave, and I think there possibly were multiple types of repairs, not just that one. So I would just say the accumulation of evidence for a reweave is compelling, and as far as comparing it to Bob's theory and others, you know, Bob's theory is internally consistent and explains a lot of things, but at this point, it's still speculative, and until we get more access to the shroud, it'll probably pretty much remain in the speculative field, whereas the evidence I've presented in the reweave is empirical scientific evidence, and it has to be explained.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for doing that. And for listeners, if you want even more detail about this issue, obviously, as I said, I've had Joe on the show before. He's done a discussion show both with Hugh Farey and with Bob Rucker. So I'll link in my blog to those shows, and you can get a lot more detail about those. But yeah, with that said, let's get into today's topics. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. Thanks. Is that showing up for everyone?
Mhm.
Yep. Perfect. All right. So from the beginning. So first thing we're going to do is look at these medieval manuscripts that allegedly prove the shroud is medieval. And just by way of recap, so I kind of framed part one by having this kind of argument, right? So premise one, if the shroud is probably medieval, I've modified that for you and for Bob and Hugh, then the shroud images are not miraculous or supernatural signs from God that Christianity is true. And then we kind of covered that and said, actually, I don't think premise one can be established. Both Bob and Hugh agreed with me on that front. And then we turned to premise two, and this is what we're focusing on now. Is it actually the case that the shroud is probably medieval? And this is where we're getting into the dating evidence. So this is the first evidence trying to establish the truth of premise two for today. And basically, we have this memo dated in 1389 by the Bishop of Troyes, Pierre D'Arcis. And in this letter, he kind of mentions the fact that he has his predecessor, Henry de Poitiers, conducted an investigation of the Leary Church when they were exhibiting the shroud. And he says, oh, they're just greedy. They're doing it for money and stuff like this. And essentially, there was an inquiry held where the artist who created the shroud himself admits, look, this is just a painted fake and stuff like that. So this is purported as evidence that proves, hey, look, the shroud is just another medieval fake relic. Now, in terms of my assessment of it that I gave on my previous shows, so in the first place, if we look at it through the lens of the bibliographical test, look, we have much later copies of this. We don't have the originals. The copies that we do have, I think, are folio 137 and 138. And the text that I just read you is kind of like a combination of both of them. None of them are dated. None of them are signed. So this is a major problem. We don't know if the memo was ever sent. There's issues with the Latin translation as well. Is it the artist or was it an artist in general who said this? We also have provable external circumstances whereby the D'Arcy had motivation to lie. For example, maybe it was him that was greedy because his church was destroyed and an expensive stained glass window was destroyed. So that was really expensive at that time. Well, he wanted to get the shroud for himself and gain the proceeds from that, perhaps. And then finally, we have a letter, and this one is dated and signed from Bishop Henry de Poitiers, the former bishop who allegedly held this inquiry right before he died. It's dated May 28th, 1356, just a few months before he died. And he doesn't mention an inquiry or any problems about the shroud. Instead, he says, look, Leary Church, spot on. I am fully satisfied. I praise, ratify, and approve of everything you're doing. So yeah, there is no historical documents that mention this. And the ones that we do have, I think, prove the opposite. Now, one thing I want to mention, because Hugh Farey, even the shroud skeptic Hugh Farey, and he'll correct me if I'm lying, but even he says, look, forget the memo. We don't need, this isn't good evidence or something like that. For him, where it's at is a papal bull by the Pope, anti-Pope Clement VII. And I think I think this is the one that Hugh's appealing to. Again, he'll correct me if I'm wrong on that, but basically the Pope says, look, you can keep on showing this thing, but you have to say it's a relic or it's a representation. You can't say it's the authentic cloth. And this supposedly proves that, hey, well, that's because they knew it was all an artistic fake. My response to that is you have to look at the surrounding documents and what's going on here. And I don't think, look at the next letter, right? Again, anti-Pope Clement, kind of reverses himself and says, okay, go ahead and keep showing it. I'm on your side now. You're doing all good and stuff like that. So I think that the Pope, we have no way to prove that the Pope had any evidence one way or the other, whether this cloth is authentic or not. He's just playing politics, essentially. He's caught in the middle of this dispute and he's, okay, fine. You know what, D'Arcis, shut up. You're perpetual silence. Stop talking about this and bugging me about it. You guys, Leary, keep showing the shroud, but, just call it a representation so it'll make people happy. It just seems like a political decision. He's not really basing it on evidence one way or the other. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's sort of my opening case on these medieval documents. And with that said, I will turn it over to, I guess, Joe Marino. Do you want to start first? You're at the top of my screen there. So,
yeah, I think your point about political issues is, rings true because of the, we can see that in the, like what I did in the book in terms of the politics with the C14, and you're going to have politics and religion back in the 14th century as well. And I think it is true that you could make a case that D'Arcis had a greed factor himself because of the fact that his own church needed repairs, and he was maybe hoping to get the relic himself. When I look at the D'Arcis memorandum, and especially when the skeptics say, "Oh, look what he said," and it's like, well, you got it's sort of like flat earthers appealing to medieval documents that say the world is flat. I mean, just because somebody says it in the Middle Ages doesn't mean it's true. You have to look at the surrounding, the context and the surrounding documents. And one fact that very few people know, and I imagine a lot of the skeptics don't know it as well, is the fact that the successor to D'Arcis was a bishop named, I don't know how you pronounce, I think his last name is spelled Raguer, something like Raguer. He proclaimed that he thought the shroud was authentic. And of course, you never see anybody, especially the skeptics, make note of that. They take his pronouncement way out of context and just try to make a case out of that alone, where there's more, and like Mark was saying, history is much more complicated than most people think. So yeah, I don't think the D'Arcis memorandum assertion by the skeptics is as strong as they think, but I think a lot of the skeptics, and Hugh is an exception in terms of he's someone who does a lot of research. A lot of people that make pronouncements on the shroud do little or no research and think they're a historian or think they're a shroud expert and say, oh, look, it's a fake. But yeah, I'm hoping that in the future more historical documents will be uncovered. And I think it's also important to remember that we like primary sources, primary documents from history, but it's also important to remember, I think, that not everything was necessarily recorded, and some documents may have gone missing. It's not all black and white with history. There's a lot of gray areas, and I'm hopeful in the future that additional documents will be uncovered surrounding this issue.
I think Joe's made a really important point there, which is basically when he said that just because someone says something in the Middle Ages doesn't mean it's true. That is a big mistake that a lot of people make when talking about history. One day, 700 years from now, Walter Macrone's work will be 700 years old. The Pope's work will be 700 years old. It doesn't make it any less true or more true than it is now. Okay, age doesn't confer truth. People have always been human. People have always made mistakes. Some people have written down those mistakes. Some people have lied, same as they do today. Dan Brown's work will one day be 700 years old. Doesn't mean it's true. It's just a novel. Age doesn't confer any kind of veracity, let's say, any kind of truth on somebody's work. Also, D'Arcis' memoir is, okay, there's the point in history where you know that something is likely to be true if it's got what we call multiple attestation. In other words, if I say that today in La Coruña, the city where I live, I saw a sheep painted blue walking along the main street in the city, well, you might think, okay, Mark's smoked something or been drinking a bit too much. But if somebody else who I don't know, never met before in my life, also says, oh, you know, today there was a blue sheep wandering around the city of La Coruña in Spain, and there's no contact between me and that person, then the most likely conclusion is that is true. Okay, and D'Arcis is by himself on this. It's just one document of a guy who says, you know, it's a painting. Does he justify it? No. Does he even know how to justify what's a painting and what isn't a painting? No, he doesn't. It's something that's taken, I think, as Joe says, skeptics tend to accord that document much more importance than it's actually worth. Same goes for a lot of pro-authenticity documents. Just because they're old doesn't mean it's true. Okay, that in itself is not a reason for deciding that something's true or not true, just because the document's old. And a couple of points here, I would just like to disagree with something Dale said at the beginning of this. And I would say that, because this turns a lot of people off, even if tomorrow documents, science, whatever, proves that the shroud dates from the 1st century and was used on the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth, I don't think even then that that's a sign from God that Christianity is true. Okay, I think that's taking things a step further than what science and history can do. That's a personal choice. There's something, maybe that's just a personal thing. I don't like it when people say either the Shroud or Sudarium is God's message to the 21st century. No, we don't know that. You might believe that, fine, absolutely fine. But that does tend to put a distance between shroud studies and sometimes the academic world, let's say. Okay, I think we have to be careful with the vocabulary on that one. I don't know what everyone else thinks about that. I'm sure Hugh would agree with that last point that I just said, but what's your take on the D'Arcis memoir, Hugh?
Well, and just before we go to Hugh, 1 second, because Hugh and Bob have been very patient, but I just want to affirm, so I fully agree with you on the last part. So maybe I just wasn't clear on what I was saying, although I do think that it constitutes miraculous evidence. One thing I want to support both Joe and Mark on, and I'm not bringing it up in this show because we're all Christians and stuff, but with atheists, I'll use what I call the Gospel of Mark test, because look, the Gospel of Mark was written, most biblical scholars place about 40 years after the resurrection, the events. Well, same with this document. It's about 40 years after the events of this inquiry. So I try to do what's the difference? Why do you dismiss the Gospel of Mark, but just blindly accept this? So I think that's a good compare and contrast test. But yeah, Hugh, you've been patient. So over to you. What's your kind of take about this?
Oh, well, yes, I've got lots of interesting things to say. I think probably I'll get a start by saying that as a good Catholic, I feel a bit nervous about the fact that any prelate that dares to think that the shroud is not genuine is probably a duplicitous, money-grasping politician desperate to try and feather their own nest. And this includes not only Bishop D'Arcis, but also the Pope Clement. What a shame. Having said that, I wonder I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions, so there's no need for anybody to answer it. But is there any evidence at all of the shroud's existence in Leary before, say, 1380? And the answer will be yes, of course, because we know it was in Leary 34 years before the D'Arcis Memorandum. And then we go, yeah, but we've discredited D'Arcis because he makes it all up. Oh. So who has ever claimed that the shroud was original during the between say 1250 and 1350 or 1360 or so? And the answer is we have no evidence that anybody thought the shroud was original except the D'Arcis Memorandum. It's only after that that people started claiming, as Joe said, we had Pope or Bishop Reguier, for example, in 1450, which was long after the shroud had left Turin, so he probably had never seen it, claimed that he thought it was genuine. So let's go back and find out if D'Arcis had made all his stuff up. What exactly did he make up? He started by saying that the shroud had appeared by the dean and chapter of Leary had acquired it. He doesn't mention Geoffrey de Charny.
No, but he's saying, what did he make up? Says it's a painting. We know it isn't a painting.
No, but I don't know.
And he says it is. Well, that's one thing
I just want to say, which bits do we decide that he's made up? So if he didn't make up, we accept that he was right, that the shroud did appear round about the time of the Battle of Poitiers. I think that's quite important because we do know from the documents of Bishop Henry, yes, I think several documents from Bishop Henry, that D'Arcis built his chapel. We know that he dedicated it to the Virgin Mary, a cult of which Bishop Henry definitely approved, and sent him a letter before he died saying that he approved of it. He doesn't mention anything to do with the shroud, and we know very well that his chapel was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. After that, we have the Battle of Poitiers in, probably Mark knows better than me, August or September 1356, at which de Charny dies. And it is then, I think, that the shroud appears. Now, whether it originally came from de Charny or whether the Dean of Leary had acquired it for himself and it had nothing whatever to do with de Charny personally, we don't know. The only evidence we have for any of the history of the shroud at that time is from this unscrupulous devil who was trying to collect money for himself in the 1390s. Makes me wonder why D'Arcis should have bothered.
It's not the only evidence. It's not the only evidence.
Well, no, I'm just going through the documentary evidence at the time. Now, before D'Arcis wrote his memorandum, although D'Arcis' memorandum is undated, Clement, the Pope, writes saying, this is a representation, but you can show it as a representation. Now, how does the Pope know it's a representation? Who told him it was a representation? Who told him it existed at all? Is this D'Arcis again, or was there somebody else? There's a lot of sort of background knowledge that we don't know.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons why the Pope might have insisted that it was shown as a representation is because of the Fourth Lateran Council, which was only less than 100 years previously, at which one of the most important statements in it declared that there could be no new relics if they weren't personally approved by the Pope. So
Okay.
if any,
how many times throughout history, just because there's a law and a rule doesn't mean that everybody sticks to it. Not even today. There's a rule against murder. Murder is illegal, but people still kill each other.
No.
Just the fact that there is a rule
slightly missing
saying
the
the
point.
Pope has to do this doesn't mean that everybody fulfilled it. And even if it did, I don't really see what you're trying to get at.
I'm saying that,
Are you trying to say that if we discredit D'Arcis, then there's no evidence that the shroud existed at that time? Is that your message?
yes. Let's go for that.
I thought so, but that's wrong. There's plenty of an earlier.
Oh no! I don't want any of all the evidence from earlier. I'm not too bothered about that. I'm not interested in at this point. We're discussing the
Why not?
memorandum. So the Constantinople, all the evidence from Constantinople and stuff, I don't think
You throw
is
it
not
out to the window
this
because it
particular
doesn't
document.
coincide with what you're trying to
No,
say.
it's not relevant to this particular discussion.
It is,
Well, let's
because you're saying there's no evidence. It's like when people say, oh, you know, the shroud isn't mentioned in history before the 1350s. That's just not true. It's mentioned from the 2nd century in various different documents.
No, it's
The
a matter
debate
of,
there is that shroud, but people give this,
Yes,
this is
yes.
something that very often a skeptic will do without trying to group all skeptics into one basket.
Thank you.
Say, you know, there's no evidence for the shroud's history before the 1350s. It's just not true. There is. Is that shroud the same one that's kept in Turin today? That's a different debate. But the shroud is mentioned from the 2nd century on.
It's mentioned in the Bible. Yes.
There is no silence. That talk about silence is just not true.
all right, guys. So
But
perfect.
I want to say, so supposing I was to grant all the evidence up till, say, the destruction of Constantinople, and then say I believe that after that the shroud was totally destroyed. Now, is there any evidence that there was a shroud in 1350?
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in here, right? So Hugh, obviously I want you to be able to finish your opening case type thing, but also Bob's waiting here, so I want to get Bob's opening case, and then we can come back to the dialogue between you guys if you want to. But yeah, Hugh, finish your opening case kind of thing on.
Yeah, okay. Well, I could just say so. I mean, I think that we're examining the documents that suggest that the shroud was in Leary around about 1350, and we're suggesting that D'Arcis made up certain aspects of it, but we don't know whether he made up any or all of it. We can't pin down. I mean, we did Bishop Henry. Are we claiming that Bishop Henry in fact knew of the shroud and approved of it? In which case we have no documents suggesting that that's true at all. Are we suggesting that D'Arcis was lying about Bishop Henry carrying out an investigation? I mean, if he didn't carry out an investigation, what happened to the shroud? Supposing we take D'Arcis's statement as true for the sake of argument, and that there was a shroud and it was being exhibited and it was claimed to be the shroud in about 1356. What happened to it? Why was it suppressed instantly? I mean, we have no evidence that the shroud existed. I mean, was being exhibited in 1360 or 1370 or 1380.
But again, Hugh,
it was hidden. It disappeared.
That's part of history.
Yes.
We don't have evidence for it every year. And if we did, then you could say, oh, but you don't have evidence for it every month. And if we did, you could say, oh, but we don't have evidence for it every day. Of course not. We're talking about the 14th century.
Yes, but it is an authenticist.
Together.
It is a prime authenticist case that we don't have evidence of the inquiry that was carried out. And now you're saying that the fact that we don't have evidence isn't important.
No, I'm not.
Whereas it is a crucial part of the authenticist case that we don't.
So what are you saying? That if we dismiss D'Arcis, then the shroud didn't exist, and it was never in Leary?
No,
and it must date from the 17th century.
What I'm saying is we must try. Why do we discredit? Why?
Because we know scientifically that it is not a painting. That's that we discredit.
Okay. No, I will.
No matter how skeptic, even if you think the shroud dates from the 20th century, scientifically it is not a painting. There is zero doubt about that. So if D'Arcis says it was a painting, cunningly painted, then he was wrong. That's what we're saying.
I perfectly concede.
It was scientifically wrong. Nothing to do with my opinion, nothing to do with Joe's opinion, nothing to do with anyone's opinion. He was wrong. No argument can go against that.
Right. I'm not going to argue it. I'm not even going to refute it, but I am going to deny it. Absolutely. The shroud is a medieval forgery. It does not exist. It did not exist before the 1350s. Okay, and I don't think any of your arguments
think it's a painting?
Carry any value.
Hugh, do you think it's a painting?
I think it may have started as a painting, not actually with a paintbrush, but probably as an imprint.
Okay, cool. So
Well, you have science against you on that, but
No, I don't. No,
fine.
no.
Yeah, you do. I mean,
Okay.
everybody's
Well,
entitled to their own opinion. but
That's the
when you have
science. And you've already
against
admitted
you-
you're not a scientist, and you're trying to go outside your field of expertise. You're a historian.
I'm not. I'm saying what experts
Okay,
have said.
so I'm going to take over as the host. So this is awesome. This is good for the informal dialogue part. You guys have gotten a great start, but I do have to be fair. Like during the opening presentations, we don't interrupt each other. Let each other give our cases, and then during the informal dialogue part afterwards, we'll talk to each other, kind of thing. But try to keep the opening presentations, 5 minutes or so, and then we come back. So. But yeah, Bob, you haven't had a chance to speak about this. So what's kind of your opening take on?
Okay. Well, I'm not an expert in history, but just in my reviewing here of the various evidences and whatnot, it seems like this is a lot to do about very little. It seems to me like this reference to an investigation, it merely says that this previous investigation had encountered a person who said that he painted the shroud. But I can think of 3 different ways that could be understood. It's ambiguous, and it doesn't necessarily mean that he painted the Shroud of Turin in total. It could mean that he touched it up. It could mean that he simply made copies of it. There were some, 42, 52, 55 copies. Various people quote the different numbers of copies of the shroud, and it may simply mean that he had made a copy of the shroud. And that would be entirely consistent with this supposed previous investigation. Secondly, the documents we're talking about are evidently drafts, and there's no evidence that they were ever sent or ever recognized by the Pope, or sometimes called the anti-Pope, Clement. So, and then it is proven, I think, conclusively, that the shroud is not a painting. So that whatever this old alleged document, this draft document says, it has no basis in truth. So it's a lot to do about relatively little. That's my take on it.
Awesome. All right, cool. Thank you. So yeah, now we can go to kind of like the informal dialogue part. One thing I'll just start before we get into the conversation between Mark and Hugh Farey and finish that off. Bob and Joe, did you guys have any like questions or comments that you wanted to make about some of the others' presentations, or Hugh's take at all, or no?
No.
Awesome. Perfect. So yeah, Mark and Hugh, I will, I'll give you guys how long do you guys need? Maybe like 10 minutes or so before we move to the next.
Oh, as long as you like. Until you stop us, if you like.
Yeah, cool. We'll keep going. Just try not to talk at the same time, because it's hard to like make it out. But other than that, I'll stand out of the way and let you experts go at it. So yeah, Mark, what do you want to tackle Hugh on, or vice versa?
Sorry, I missed that. You were cut there. What did you say, Dale?
Oh, I was just saying, so I'll get out of the way and let you guys go on. But Mark, what did you want to tackle Hugh's case on, or vice versa? Hugh, what did you want to tackle Mark on?
Well, perhaps I'll start while Mark's catching up. I'm not sure that the D'Arcis Memorandum, I mean, I agree that the D'Arcis Memorandum is not as important as it is sometimes given credit for. As everyone agrees, it's undated and it's unsigned. However, it fits in perfectly with all the bulls that we do have from Pope Clement. It also fits in with the statement of what was his name? I forget. Hippolyte or Humbert of Villesexel, sorry, I just had to look him up, who was given the shroud to take away from Leary, either just before or just after the Battle of Agincourt, because they thought it might get taken by the British. Me. But he says he signs a receipt for a representation of the shroud. I can't find anybody who ever thought that the shroud was not a representation, or any evidence that the shroud was thought of by anybody as not a representation, until about 1450 or so, when Marguerite was hawking it around Europe saying, come and look at my relic. Now, is there any evidence that anybody thought that the Shroud of Leary was original before, say, let's 1420?
And those 50 years sort of convince you that some guy who is scientifically mistaken in the 1350s says one thing, and 50 years later somebody says the opposite, and those 50 years mean that he is right and she's wrong.
Did anybody think it was original? That's a simple enough question.
Well, of course they did. It was just one of those things that you didn't have to say because nobody had argued against it until D'Arcis. People just accepted it.
Really?
Rightly or wrongly?
Why was it not exhibited?
When?
Between 1350 and 1480, 1490?
Absolutely no idea, because the people who had it didn't want to. Why isn't it exhibited in 2022?
Well,
it belongs to the Vatican, and the Vatican decide not to do it. It's as simple as that.
You can go and see where it is. I mean, but I'm told by authenticists that this was a way of making lots and lots of money. And yet the Leary people apparently decided not to exhibit it at all. And you don't know why?
Well, of course we don't know why. We don't know everything about the Middle Ages.
Well, D'Arcis suggests that...
Do you know why do they exhibit the Shroud today? In the 21st century or the 20th century?
Well, of course I know why. Yeah, I mean, it's a massive Christian symbol. And yes, Dale, yeah.
I just want to ask you, because from my understanding, we do have proof that, like, you're not denying that the Shroud existed in the 1350s. You're saying it just wasn't exhibited. But what about the Pilgrim's badges? Like, that has his thing. It dates to the... Okay, yeah.
Perfect. I was hoping somebody might come up with those. Yes. Of course, we don't know when they date to because they don't have any dates on them. But they do have coats of arms. And at one point, we were very happy that the earliest badge found was also the earliest badge made, because it has the Shani coat of arms in the prime place of honor, I think, and the de Vergy coat of arms next to it. And then the second badge that were found has them the other way round. And Ian Wilson discusses this at some length in one of the British Society newsletters, British Society of the Turin Shroud newsletters. And he's slightly changed his mind, and he thinks that perhaps the first badge offers primacy to, as it were, Mrs. de Charny, her husband having been killed at the Battle of Poitiers, and the de Charny badge represents the infancy of her son. And the second badge, which shows the de Charny arms in prime position, is from about the 1390s, when de Charny II started to exhibit the shroud. And of course, it should be mentioned that de Charny II, when he started to exhibit the shroud, he didn't say that it was original. He said it was a representation. He just exhibited
what's a representation? What do you mean by representation, Hugh?
A copy. I mean, not the real thing. A figuram out represent.
I don't see that from a linguistic or etymological point of view. But
well, the Latin. Okay, I think the Latin. I think the Latin is perfectly clear about it.
No, Latin is perfectly clear.
It is a figuram sive representationem about 15 times in every one of Clement's.
But representation is not the same as fake. Not even as painting.
Well, it doesn't mean definitely. Well, non est means it is not the original shroud. Now that appears in at least 2 bulls.
Yeah.
Now that's pretty conclusive. That rather suggests that the person who wrote it didn't think it was original.
It completely suggests that. Doesn't mean he was right.
Oh no, not
Just
at all.
One person, you say one thing, I say another thing.
They could have
700 years from now, people might look at our arguments and
well,
say,
obviously,
well, they can't both be right.
Well, yes, to any
say just on the basis of
yes,
one
yeah,
person
obviously
says it was a painting and is not the original, therefore we've proven it's a fake. It
no,
doesn't.
to any yes, to anybody,
Sorry.
to anybody
I
who is.
want to ask Mark.
Sorry.
I want to ask Mark a question. So, okay, finish your thought in like a minute or so. But I have a question for Mark before we move on as well. So.
Sorry, do you want me to? I was going to say yes. Well, to anybody who is absolutely convinced that the shroud is genuine, then obviously there must be something wrong with all the evidence which suggests that it's not genuine.
Of course.
However, anybody who's convinced that the shroud is not genuine can validly think that there is something wrong with all the evidence that suggests that it is. I mean, that's the point about a debate.
Yeah.
All right.
Something. Sorry, go on, Dale. Sorry, you had a question.
So now, yes, you ask your question.
No problem. So yeah, Mark, I wanted to, obviously you are a historian, so I wanted to kind of get your take. I mentioned, and by the way, for all of the panelists, you guys can share your screen at any time if you want to, or ask me to share, but I'm just gonna go back to sharing my PowerPoint because I wanted to ask you, Mark, about these other documents. Like, look, we have a letter from Henry de Portier, and he seems to be suggesting the exact opposite. There's no mention of this inquiry or an artist as well. So surrounding the papal bull, we have about 7 or so documents. I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of those, but what's your take on these other documents? Does that really back up Hugh's claims in your view or not?
Well, I mean, just as documents, the only thing that documents tell us is what the person who wrote it thought, okay? Not necessarily the truth, especially if the 2 documents contradict each other, or the 25 documents contradict each other, someone must be wrong. As far as, this is a problem not just with the shroud, it's a problem with history documents, problem with any ancient or medieval documents. Mainly what they teach us is what the person who wrote them thought, not necessarily an empirical truth. As happens in so many fields, we do tend to know more about what is not true than what is necessarily true. And my take, like I was saying, on the D'Arcis Memorandum is what I would disagree with is, he says it's a painting. It isn't. And that's not Mark speaking, that's science speaking. And it doesn't matter that I'm not a scientist because I can read and I do understand what scientists say. All I'm saying is I wouldn't do research into that because I'm not capable of it. I do research into history. It's a proven fact that the shroud, no matter what it is, no matter what it isn't, no matter what it shows, no matter what its message is or isn't, it's not a painting, okay? And I think that if you get outside that, then the debate is like lost in a way. I mean, you have to start with certain scientific facts. That's why I would disagree, Dale, with what you said at the beginning about the shroud being God's sign that Christianity is true. That's a personal opinion. It's not science. Okay, it's respectable and everything, but it's a personal opinion. The fact that the shroud is not a painting is not an opinion. Okay, that's just is. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with admitting that. Okay, and I think if you deny that, then well, you could go anywhere after that. It was sent by an alien. It was produced by, it was a medieval photograph. I mean, you can go anywhere with that. It isn't. That you're getting into a bit like outside of the serious topics when you get into that kind of thing.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So I see that Hugh raised his hand. So yeah, Hugh, I'll give you a couple minutes. Bob and Joe, you guys are still
just to respond to that one about the document that we do have from Bishop Henry, and in fact we have a couple in which Bishop Henry extols Geoffrey Charnay the First's ambitions to build a chapel, and then it took him ages before it was finally consecrated. But all this was excellent, as I've said. But then he died, and then it is the Dean of Leary who procures this cloth from we know not where, at least according to D'Arcis, who might not be telling the truth. So that's by that particular document doesn't clash with. There's no need to worry. It doesn't clash with the idea that the shroud was produced later on.
Okay, cool, awesome.
It doesn't clash with D'Arcis's idea that he then carried out an inquest to find out who was exhibiting this shroud in the church dedicated to the Virgin Mary.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, so Bob and Joe, again, you guys have been patient. Do you have anything that you want to contribute on this lastly before we move on to the next topic? No.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Hugh's comment about, I forget how he phrased it, but because we thought D'Arcis might be greedy, that every Catholic prelate, we're saying every Catholic prelate is greedy, which we're not saying that. We're saying in D'Arcis' situation, based on the evidence, he might have been greedy. We're not talking about other Catholic prelates. I think that's kind of
well, I'm glad about that. But and Pope Clement, he was sort of hedging his bets. He knew it was authentic or thought it might be authentic, but he didn't want to upset the politics of the time.
Well, very possibly. Politics play a role in religion all the time, and we can, it's hard to guess what was in their mind 700 years ago. I'm just saying it was a possibility that politics were in the forefront there.
I'd agree with that. I just wanted to raise the flag, being a good Roman Catholic.
Fair enough.
As far as I understand it, none of these people saw the shroud. So what merit is anything that they say? I just don't understand why there's so much effort on this issue, because as far as I understand it, none of these people actually investigated the shroud. Yeah. So why would we believe them at all?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, that was the point I think I and Mark were raising as well. Like, at the end of the day, they don't have the proper evidence to base their opinion on. So it's based on something else, whether it's politics, whatever. We can speculate, but we don't have to know. At the end of the day, we have this undercutting defeater that.
Also,
yes, I could just I'll add another historical thing onto that, which is interesting, because you're quite right. Of all these early documents, it's not obvious that anybody at all, had actually seen the shroud. The first eyewitness account, I mean, whether we can count Humber de Villisexel, who actually took the shroud from Leary with him and his wife, was it his wife or with Margaret de Charny? He may have seen the shroud and called it a representation. And then the next time we hear it described, I think, is when it turns up in Liège, and oh my goodness, I've forgotten his name, Zanciflet or something like that. He also examined it very carefully and said it was a representation. So the first two people who do describe it from an eyewitness point of view, they say it's a painting. Not that they're necessarily right. That's what they say. No. They definitely say it's an artistic. No. Zanciflet says it's an artistic work. No. The Zanciflet says it's an artistic work. I mean, he definitely says.
Okay, so let Mark come back, and then we'll move on to the next. So yeah, Mark.
Peter Macron said the same, and what? He's wrong. I mean, again, we're getting back to that. It's pointless arguing about whether it's a painting or not. It isn't.
Okay.
Well, I disagree.
And it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist. Just a minute.
If I was just to say here, look, you're objectively and entirely impartially, you're completely wrong. It is a fake. Then we're just going to start at each other shouting, "No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong." But no, I'm a scientist. I know all the scientific evidence.
Science is on my side, not on your side.
Let's try to.
You're entitled to your opinion. But there are flat earthers as well. They're entitled to their opinion.
No, but I think you're the flat earther in this case, you see. That's the trouble.
Why? Just because I think that something might be related to Jesus of Nazareth?
No, because you've come to an unsustainable conclusion.
So let's stop, right? Okay. So we have a disagreement. That's great. And there's going to be future shows where we're discussing specifically the evidence, the scientific evidence for the painting hypothesis. So that's coming up in a future panel show, and you guys are both welcome back, and we can go into that. But I think at this point we do have two other topics to cover. So I do want to move on to the next one, the next bit of evidence, the positive case as a rebutting defeater to premise two, proving, look, the shroud is probably not medieval. And that is, let me just share my screen here for everyone. Oops, that's the wrong thing. Okay.
That's good.
There you go. So with this art history and numismatic coins argument, in my Shroud Solo Show Part 2, I laid out three evidential lines. So the first are these famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, these Vignon markings. And that's the case that throughout art history, there have been certain odd features on depictions of Jesus that show up on various Byzantine paintings dating from the 6th century to the 1204 with the Fourth Crusade kind of thing, when the shroud was lost, apparently, according to the pro shroud side. So there's this link here. The second is Alan Wanger's use of the polarized image overlay technique. And again, he compared various Byzantine paintings and coins using this technology. And using forensic points of comparison, he found that there were, up to 200, I think, points of comparison on some of these things, proving that the shroud was the common source for this. Now, just by way of an update, I've looked into this a little bit more detail based on feedback I've gotten. I now wouldn't use this evidence. So that's my update. I think that this evidence fails. When you look at the forensic criteria, it's a little bit more complicated than what Alan Wanger was proposing. But that's just my take. We'll see what the panelists have to say about that. And then finally, we have Giulio Fanti's 2015 statistical analysis, specifically of the various Byzantine coins. For example, on the 692 coins, let me just bring up, he found that there was over 99.99% probability that the shroud provided the common source for these coins, specifically on one coin. And here's one. You can see some of the 15 similarities based on the blood stains, the swollen eyebrow and stuff like that. So these are all let me just go to the end. So so he did use these to do the statistical analysis, and he discovered that, as I said, there was less than 0.01% probability statistically that the shroud was not used as the source for these coins and stuff like that, dating to 692 to 695. So yeah, with that said, that's it for my opening case in a nutshell. But I'll turn it over to my guests. What's your take on some of these things? We can take it bit by bit. Do you guys prefer to start with the Vignon markings, or do you want to tackle all three at once, or what do you guys want to do?
I'm happy to do them one at a time, but I feel I've somewhat monopolized the discussion so far. So if other people would like to give their take on it. Also, I've got my paper on the Vignon markings, which I could share with people if they wanted.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah.
I'm happy to let other people take the lead on it, because I'm aware that I've rather dominated it so far.
All right, cool. So let's take it one at a time. So let's start with the Vignon markings. And yeah, Bob, what's your take on the Vignon markings? Do you think it's good evidence, or?
I haven't studied this. I would have to admit that up front, and not being an expert on it, but it seems to me like it would be a difficult task to do a proper statistical analysis of these markings. I think that there could be a compelling argument made that there's an agreement between what's on the shroud and what's on the coins. I think that there is, but how you would develop a statistical analysis to prove a probability, I think is another issue. So I'm a little bit hesitant on taking an opinion on that, not having read it. Okay.
Awesome. So you're talking about the 2015 Giulio Fanti's statistical argument based on the coins. You're a little iffy on that. Okay, cool. Yeah, Joe Marino, what's your take about any of these three arguments?
As far as the Vignon markings, I think it's very suggestive. I think art history can tell us a lot. I think it is hard to kind of quantify it exactly, but you have to take into account each artist is going to have its own artistic bias or intent. But I remember reading somewhere, it might have been in Wilson's book or something, his 78 book, that one Byzantine painting had all 15 of the Vignon markings. And that, if that's true, I mean, it's somewhat subjective. That would be very suggestive. I find very compelling, for example, on some of the coins, and the fact that where there's the fold mark at the bottom of the neck on the shroud, the artist seemed to incorporate a fold there in the exact, the two parallel lines. I think those are very suggestive. I'd love to see some more art historians jump in. I think Thomas de Wesselo's book was very important. I think he's an expert in the time period in which if the shroud was forged. He says it doesn't match with that period. So I think art history is part of the equation, part of the puzzle, and I think it's part of the preponderance of the evidence that's suggestive. It's never going to be probably 100% conclusive, but I think the markings are very suggestive. And I'll just say here, at some point, I've got a picture of a representation of Jesus from Ravenna, Italy, in around the 4th century. And I got these from Russ Braille because I saw it in one of his PowerPoint presentations. And the first one that was in the church is kind of the Roman, the beardless and the clean shaven and all that sort of thing. And then if one believes that the shroud was rediscovered as the image of Edessa in around 544, that same church with 100 years later on the opposite side of the church shows kind of a shroud like Jesus. And that's only in a 100-year period, which seems like a long time, but in history, in historical terms, that's just a drop in the bucket. But hopefully at some point I can share that and show those two representations that I got from Russ.
Yeah, well, if you want, I can stop sharing my screen. You can share right now if you want.
All right, good. Try it. Okay.
Cool.
Let's see. No.
On the bottom, it'll say share screen. You know how to do it, yeah.
Let's see. See if I can get it. Am I getting it now? Let's see. Okay, there's the first one.
Okay.
So fourth century in Ravenna, and then about 100 years later, it's that. So I think these sort of images are very compelling.
Awesome. Perfect. All right, cool. Well, yeah, with that, I want to turn it to Mark Guscin. Again, you are a historian here. So what's your sort of take on all three of these lines of evidence that I've laid out? Do you find any?
My own personal opinion is I don't think the Vignon markings, most of them probably don't even exist. I don't agree with that line of argument at all. I think if somebody was going to use the shroud image as inspiration for a painting, they would have made it a lot clearer and done it a lot better. I don't buy into the Vignon markings at all. Just as an example, the fact that, if there's an inverted 3 on the forehead, I'm not going to paint it as 2 strands of hair going like that. I'll paint it as an inverted 3. That just doesn't make any sense. Same goes with the Wanger and the overlay project. It's a good idea. I saw him do it live. I can't remember at which Shroud Congress. Maybe it was one of the Dallas ones. I really don't remember. But it got to a point at the end where I got the impression that if you've got 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth, well, he can do the overlay and you look like the man on the shroud. I don't buy into that either. I just thought it was looking for things that sound good. A lot of people like it. A lot of people think it's nice. I'm very skeptical on that point. And as for the coins and Giulio Fanti, I haven't looked at that in enough detail. There might be something there. Again, not sure. I'm not sure about that one. Fairly sure against the first two of those three items that you said. For me, the Vignon markings and the Wanger overlay don't show anything. It's wishful thinking.
Awesome, awesome.
My opinion, and I reserve the right to be wrong.
Yeah,
Okay?
absolutely. I won't hold you to account, so don't worry. All right, cool. So yeah, Hugh, coming to you last.
I'll just have a look, see if I can
Share your screen.
get
Yeah.
a document up. I'd quite like to share a screen if I may.
Yep, for sure.
Whoops, hang on a second. I'm going to try and find it first. Where's my Vignon things? Thought I had them. The point where instantly we find. Oh no. I haven't got the Vignon things here, but what I have got, here we go, is some gold coins. Right, now, do I click on share screen or
Yeah,
yes,
click
I
on
click
share
on share
screen.
screen.
It'll pop up like a box. Click on, okay, you're doing
Oh,
it.
lovely. It's
There you
awfully big. There we go. Oh, I can make them smaller. Right, can we see lots of them?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I did here was I Googled Justinian II, gold coins, and minus shroud. If you don't put minus shroud in, then the whole thing is packed with Giulio's own findings, which are, of course, designed to show you that these coins are all derived from the shroud, so they all have a sort of similarity. But this is the first. I was trying to get 30, but or whatever it is, 464, 24, but I only managed to find 22 in the time. And these are mostly coins from the Justinian era. Some of them may have just crept in because they were there under. I found them under those headings. And if we look at them, we can certainly see that they have a generic similarity. Yeah, I mean, I think one would be mad not to say that they didn't all show a Christ facing forwards. He mostly has long hair falling on either side and that sort of thing, and he has a beard. Every single one of them, of course, shows him holding a book. Everyone has him holding a book and has his hands in a very particular position. You can see with two fingers divided like that in a definite place. Yes, one would suggest that all these derive from a common ancestor. And that common ancestor is one in which Jesus was holding a book and had his hands like that. They couldn't all, I think, have just been only derived from the shroud. Otherwise, there'd be no point. There'd be no reason for every single one to have Jesus's hands in exactly that position. So I think we have to go at least 2 steps backwards. And I think this is where perhaps Giulio and probably, that young man who's just written an article for the Numismatics magazine, who's been looking at the same thing, but through copper coins. So we can't say, and I think it would be wrong to say, that the person anybody who carved the dies on any of these must necessarily have seen the shroud. It's much more likely that he saw an image that he copied from. They can't, surely all of them wouldn't have got the fingers in exactly that position on the basis of just guesswork. And so I think we have to go back from here to another image, and we don't have that original image, but we might guess that original you might speculate, and I would follow you along on that thing if you would do that, to say that, well, that image derived from the shroud. And of course, now we're 2 images away, and it's a bit difficult to tell. I mean, just by glancing at the ones that I put on your screen, we can see that every single one of these has ears. Now, I think, bless him, Giulio's managed to find a couple which don't have ears, just like the shroud, and have much straighter hair. But these ones do have ears, suggesting that the image they were all copied from mostly did have ears. I think the ones, if you manage to find one which doesn't have ears, then that's maybe just an exception. It doesn't necessarily mean that that particular chap had to go to wherever it was, to the Shroud, and copy it. So I think Giulio's case is weakened by the fact that I don't think these demonstrate that they must have been copied directly from the original Shroud. Also, we can see, of course, I mean, just goes without saying, some of them have a pointed beard, some of them have a forked beard, some of them have a blunt beard, some of them have a long beard. The proportions between their eyes varies according to the proportion between the eyes and the nose. And the fact that you can find one or two coins which have exactly the same proportions of eyes and nose as the Shroud is not terribly convincing, given all the other coins which don't. I think one of the things that people sometimes mistake is that if you can find one coin which matches the Shroud, that means that the Shroud must have been the source of that coin. I think you have to consider all the other coins minted at around about the same time. These are mostly over about a 10-year period, where the Shroud is not perfectly matched.
No. That's not a good line of argument, Hugh. I think I used this as an example once in an article. If I say that I've got the hat that Napoleon was wearing at the Battle of Waterloo, and I put it among 30 hats that Napoleon wasn't wearing at the Battle of Waterloo,
yes,
that doesn't mean that that one hat is any less genuine. I agree with your general viewpoint about the coins. I don't think they're Shroud inspired, but just because there are other coins that aren't, doesn't mean that one can't be, in theory.
Well, yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll follow that. Now, I just want to mention a little game which I used to play with my children in maths classes, which sort of covers Giulio's probability thing. And that is that you take a coin which appears to match the Shroud, and you go, what are the chances of it doing this, and what are the chances of it doing that, and what are the chances of it doing this? And you end up with 1 in squillions. Yeah. And I used to ask the children in my class, what were the chances of my tossing a coin right in front of them, right there, heads 10 times? I think 8 times it probably was. And they'd all go, it was very unlikely. And I said, well, I can do it. I'll do it every class. I'll do it every 3 times, 5 times every class. And they would all go, well, how can you do that? And of course, I got a jar of 400 coins. Mm-hmm. And I threw them all on the floor, took half of them away, threw them all on the floor, took half of them away, threw them all on the floor. And by the time there was only a few left, those coins had all of them achieved, or those 3 or 4 coins, or 2 or 3 coins left, had achieved whatever it was, a 1 in a million chance of happening. And they went, yes, but that doesn't count. But of course, this is exactly what happens with these coins. That's very similar to, and all these probability estimates that people come up with are rather based on that sort of thing.
I agree, but in theory, the argument doesn't, the fact that there could be 100 coins not inspired by the Shroud doesn't mean that there might not be, and I'm not saying there is, but doesn't mean that there might not be one that is.
Oh, not in itself. No, I agree with that. But
I agree, they're not. I agree with you. I don't think they're Shroud inspired.
Yeah.
But,
now there's quite a lot of people other than our 2 Shroud authenticists have studied these coins, and indeed all the Byzantine images that appear to be of this similar kind, and they tend to think that they either came from the roof of the Hagia Sophia, which was the big church in Constantinople, and still is, except that it's been rebuilt a couple of times, or from a massive mosaic above the bronze gate of the old palace of Constantinople. And there's, without actually seeing what those originally were, we can't pick out particular markings. And I think that Mark was absolutely right here I'm going slightly back now to the Vignon markings. I'm going to stop showing, and I'm sorry that I thought I had got my Vignon mark thing ready to show, but perhaps I didn't. Let me just.
Is it just the white? Like, do you want me to share my thing of it? Like, you're talking about just the thing with the numbers on the face, or something?
No, it wasn't that. Well, I mean, you can put it up if you like. Now, I think, as far as I know, it might be useful. Yes, it'll just help everybody to remember. Now, this drawing, as far as I can recall, I think was done by an American called Wenchel, Arthur Wenchel, Joe will know.
Edward
Wenchel, who derived it. He didn't copy it. He derived it from a book in French by Paul Vignon, which has never been translated. I have a copy of it, and I've translated it. And what is very interesting about when Vignon starts discussing his markings is that he sees them on just about every possible Byzantine depiction. And now he begins rather like Joe does with that one of the baptistries in Ravenna in Italy, which was very much a senior center of the Byzantine culture of the time. And he spots especially that little square, which is marked 2 on the top of the brow there. And he says, look, this has influenced the whole of Byzantine portraiture. And I'm going to show you some examples. And his book is full of examples, and they are, for example, none of them of Christ. They begin with dozens and dozens of mosaics of apostles, all of whom have this square directly above them, and Paul going, look, this has got a really good square. And then he starts mentioning other things, and you'll see number 1 is a transverse line across the forehead, which practically every Byzantine mosaic has got that sort of smudge across its forehead. In fact, practically every picture of everybody has got a smudge like that across their forehead, because that's what people look like. And then he goes into things like the nose is swollen on one side but not on the other. And again, every single portrait has got the nose bigger on one side than it has on the other. It's nothing to do with the shroud. It's just what people actually look like. If you try and pick out things which are characteristic exclusively of the shroud, one of the interesting things is number 13, which you can see at the bottom there, which some people claim are fold lines, which obviously don't appear on real people, but they are mirrored according to some people, but not Vignon. He didn't pick this up sensibly, as we'll see, because he never saw them. But they're picked up, according to some people, in the double hem of the neckline of people's tunic when they're wearing it. But the reason why Paul Vignon never mentioned it is because those fold lines didn't exist at the time when he saw the shroud. If we look at the the Secondo Pio picture of the shroud's face, of the face of the shroud, those lines at the bottom there, that fold doesn't exist at all. And so consequently, it couldn't. It's a feature of the fact that the shroud was rolled up. In fact, nearly all the creases on the shroud, I think, most clearly are features of the rolling up of the shroud in the 19th century, and they have nothing to do with anything that was there in the 3rd or 4th century. One possible piece of evidence for this is that we do know that the shroud was folded quite seriously and packed tightly into a reliquary in 1534 when the Great Fire, was it 1534? Got to get it right. Yes, when the big fire broke out.
32.
32. Thank you, Mark. Well, for some reason, none of those folds are now visible on the shroud, but we are asked to suppose that certain folds that, in fact, were there in the 4th century. So the fold thing doesn't work out for me at all. Anyway, I do recommend. It's in it's in the Medieval Shroud 3. Wait a minute. I think I'm going to share a screen, if I may. Can I share a screen?
Yep, go ahead.
You'll love this. Oops, let me try and find it first. Right. Here we go. Oh, I think, hang on, I've got to unshare that and share something else, I think.
All right. While you're bringing that up, I'll just.
Can I, oh, hang on, I'm going to close that and share this.
Okay, so while he's
keep talking about, yeah.
I just want to kind of summarize. So I find it fascinating. It sounds like all of us are more or less kind of agreeing on this, like on the take on there. So like for my own take, so I think the Ellenwanger is a failure. It's probably false. I was kind of with Joe Marino. I think the art history, the Vignon markings are suggested, but it's interesting. Mark is saying it's a failure, and Bob and Hugh saying it's a failure, and Bob's kind of not that much on it and stuff like that. So that's interesting. I'm kind of on the fence with it myself. The one thing that's very interesting for me, that's kind of a shock, is about the statistical thing, because I did think that was kind of a good argument, but to hear Bob and Hugh both agreeing that, well, look, there's no basis for a statistical argument. If Hugh's got his screen up. So I have a question for Bob and Hugh after Hugh finishes this, about the probability. I just want to ask a question about that. But other than that, it sounds like we're all on the same page. So yeah, we can move on to the Sudarium, the main topic for everyone here. So
okay, can we see the baptistry of Ravenna here?
yeah,
it's got it's still there to this very day. There is the dome above the baptistry. There is John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, and all the apostles in a ring round the outside. Now, according to Paul Vignon, Christ was put in before anyone had seen the image of Edessa, which he takes as the original for all the Vignon markings. He thinks that the image of Edessa was identified with the shroud, and so he starts with that. So he thinks that this was before the image of Edessa, which interestingly still shows Jesus with long hair and a beard, but it doesn't have any of his markings. But the apostles round the outside, according to Vignon, all show some markings. This is my translation around here underneath at the bottom, but we don't need to go through that. But can you see that the middle two, especially St. James the Greater and St. Peter, have got those beautiful little squares? Now, what's interesting about Vignon is that he thinks that the squares are totally unrepresentative of anything you might see in real life. Here at last, I may say on the right-hand side, we finally have Jesus, but he starts with all these other apostles who have, as you can see, one nostril bigger than the other. They have the stripe line across the front, and several others. But he finds that here are the two little things, but he finds that, I must find this thing. He gets excited about the fact that no one could possibly have put the square in between anybody's brows unless they had seen the Shroud of Turin, because they were totally anatomically unlikely. Well, as you can see, I have found a picture of someone with this extraordinarily anatomical, unlikely three-cornered square right between his brows in exactly the place where the catacomist got it. So I think Vignon got a bit carried away. Can you see? I'm going to just read out this little bit in italics here. The supranasal square, he calls it, has a deliberate lack of anatomical significance. The blatant futility of what would seem to us to be a bizarre ornament if we didn't know that it shows one of the most significant of the accidents found on the shroud itself. Well, I could just think that Vignon must never have looked at people as he wandered through the streets of Paris. Lots of old people have got, nearly everybody has got two vertical lines on either side of their nose, and quite a lot of people have got a wrinkle between them at the bottom. So yes, I mean, we all sort of agree with each other, but I don't think the Vignon markings really exist. That's all I've got to say, really.
Okay, all right, cool. So yeah, I think again, we all agree. So I think I'll just ask a couple questions for people to give their take on if they want. So one thing, Hugh Farey. So I noticed, I read your paper, and I'll be linking to that on my blog and stuff about the Vignon markings. And one thing that you kind of mentioned is that some of these markings are not unique to Jesus. They're also on apostles or other figures and stuff like that. So I kind of just wanted to ask you and also the other panelists, how many of the features, there's that list of 15 features or whatever that some people have identified, and I get that some of us are saying, well, we don't think there are those 15, but how many of the established ones can you find on other figures outside of Jesus? And I'll throw that open to Hugh and to also other people.
Yeah, all of them. I mean, Paul Vignon they're his markings. He wrote the book, and he illustrates every single one with saints and clerics and even emperors, who are not Jesus. as well as, I mean, quite often he mentions Jesus as well, of course. But yes, all of them occur on other images.
Okay. Other panelists, what do you guys make of that question? Or
I think Diana Fulbright did a paper on markings in Byzantine paintings and stuff, and I think she was of the opinion that some of the so-called Vignon markings could be found on other, non-Jesus representations. I can't remember. I think it might have been in the Frascati conference. I'm not 100% sure, which I happened to discover that those papers used to be online, and I just discovered by chance the other day that they took those papers down. I've got a print copy of the proceedings, but unfortunately they took down the online versions of them.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Oh,
Sorry,
go ahead,
I
Mark.
was going to say, Hugh, so you can see that just as D'Arcis made a mistake, so did Paul Vignon. He's mistaken. He totally believed it. I think he totally believed what he was writing. I don't think he was out to deliberately deceive anybody, but he was wrong. I mean, pro-authenticity people can be just as wrong as anti-authenticity people. Time, science, and history, new discoveries tend to reappraise older findings, and I think the Vignon markings are a victim of that, of people looking into it and saying, well, actually, it's not true.
Awesome. All right, cool. And last
Agree.
Very cool.
Agree on something.
So this question I want to ask to Bob before we move on to the Sudarium kind of thing. And so this was something that I did find genuinely shocking today, was that all of you guys kind of are hesitant to accept the statistical argument. And I wanted to ask you, so when you mentioned that we can't establish a proper statistical basis, and Hugh mentioned his experiment with the 400 coins, are we kind of saying, well, sure, Giulio got this probability of 1 out of a billion, or 7 out of a billion, but that's not a saturated probability. It's not taking into account the various probabilistic resources or some like specificational or replicational. Like what exactly is the issue with the probability calculation there?
Yes, well, my opinion here would be that the marking, the similarity between the coins and what we see on the shroud is suggestive that what we see on the coins had originally, it goes back to what was on the shroud. It seems to me like that there are enough similarities. There's a perfect frontal image, large eyes, a long nose, a mustache, beard, hair parted in the middle, coming down on both sides, a little bit longer on one side than the other. All those are similarities. Now, there's a tendency to go into too much detail, which I don't think we need to go there. But I think there's a general similarity here, so that the shroud did exist long prior to the carbon dating value of 1260 to 1390, because of the paintings and the coins, images on the coins containing these similar characteristics. Now, once you say that, I'm not saying that it's impossible to do a statistical analysis to come up with a probability. It's just that I've not studied Giulio Fante's chapter on that issue, but I could not imagine myself how it could be done to come up with an accurate value. That's all I'm saying. Now, it might prove that it's very unlikely, but to come up with a specific value, I think is another issue. But since I haven't read the chapter, I can't make a definitive conclusion on it, but that's just my take on it. I would, in going into reading his chapter, I would be somewhat skeptical going into it, but I could be proven wrong.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, yeah, with that said, I want to get into the final topic, the main topic. And with this one, I'm going to butt out. I'm not going to give my opening case. I'm actually going to go over to Mark to give the opening case for this Sudarium of Oviedo. What is this about? How is it linked to the shroud? So yeah, well, go ahead and give your opening case and take it away. And one thing, do you want me to share Do you have like a screen to share about the Sudarium, or do you want me to put up like a picture of it? Or
Yeah, I've got images to share on this. To begin with, just a second. Share.
Well,
Right.
okay.
If you just ask what is the Sudarium of Oviedo, the simple answer in a photograph is that. Okay, a dirty piece of cloth that's stained in some way, full of crease marks, no image. By itself, a picture of it doesn't tell us anything at all. Okay. It's made of linen, poorer quality linen than the shroud. The name Sudarium, I still call it the Sudarium in English. It's a Latin word that is related to the word sudor, which is sweat. Okay, so some people call it a sweat cloth, but if you go back to classical sources, Sudarium has various different uses. It's used in a Roman poet, Martial, as a kind of towel that he took to the barber when he had his hair cut and had his beard trimmed to, clean up afterwards. In Petronius, it's a cloth that a cook in a hot sweaty kitchen, had around his neck to wipe the sweat from his forehead. According to Suetonius, the Emperor Nero used to cover his mouth with a Sudarium to protect his voice because he thought he was a great singer. So the uses are of a cloth that doesn't exist in the 21st century. Some people call it a handkerchief, a kerchief, headcloth. There's no direct equivalent in the English language of everything that a Sudarium meant in the Roman world, okay? Which is why I prefer to just call it a Sudarium, the Latin word for it, okay? It's been in Oviedo since, Oviedo is a city in the north of Spain. That's the cathedral, okay, in Oviedo. Obviously, the cathedral, that part of it is very recent. There's a part inside it which dates to the 9th century, okay, which is where the Sudarium is kept today. It's been there ever since the city was founded in the 8th century. See, the big difference, before I actually get into what these bloodstains can show us, is that whereas the history of the shroud is totally open to debate, as I say, there is a shroud. The burial shroud of Christ is mentioned in historical documents from the 2nd century on. There's no doubt that it existed. The debate there is that shroud in those documents the one that is kept today in Turin in the north of Italy, okay? But there is no silence, as some people would have us believe. The shroud is never heard of before the 14th century. Not true. Might not necessarily be the Shroud of Turin. That's a different argument. But the shroud is not, it doesn't go through 1200 years of silence, let's say. Okay, it's there. On the other hand, the history of the Sudarium, which is my field as a historian, what I've researched in all the manuscripts, which I'll show in a few minutes, is fairly easy, at least in comparison to the shroud, to establish. In other words, we've got multiple attestation here, manuscripts that were copied in what today is Belgium, France, Spain, all kinds of different documents from different periods that in their essential details tell the same story, okay? That the Sudarium was kept in Palestine. Well, Palestine. The name business is always difficult. Do we call places by today's names or the names they had then? It was kept near Jerusalem until the beginning of the 7th century, when the Persians invaded and conquered Jerusalem, and there was a mass exodus of Christians running away basically from the Persians, and they took with them their relics, among which was this Sudarium, no matter what it is or isn't in the end, okay? and it came over the Mediterranean into Spain, was kept in Toledo, which was the Visigothic capital. Same story again, 711, the Moors from the north of Africa invaded and conquered Spain. Christians fled north to escape the Muslims, and the cloth went with them and has been in the area ever since. Okay, when the city of Oviedo was founded as the capital of Christian Spain, that's where it's been ever since. It's a fairly well-established history. Okay, but what is the cloth? If we get back to the cloth, the first thing you can see, it's stained with something. Okay, again, this was analyzed in a laboratory. What do those stains consist of? They consist of 1 part human blood and 6 parts pleural edema fluid. Okay, pleural edema is when you die from asphyxiation or suffocation, your lungs fill with this liquid. Pleural edema, well, an edema, you know what an edema is, pleural just comes from the Latin word for the lungs, okay? According to most doctors who, apart from Fred Zugiber, who have studied the shroud, that is a liquid that would have gathered in the lungs of somebody who was crucified. Okay, so immediately we could say, okay, it looks like these stains come from somebody who, again, crucified. You see, can we say crucified? What you can say medically and scientifically is that these stains come from a dead body that was dead in an upright position with the arms outstretched. Is that crucifixion? Could be compatible with crucifixion, but you cannot say scientifically that person was crucified. You can say he died in an upright position with both arms outstretched. Okay, that's the difference between wishful thinking and what the science of this can tell us. So how were the stains made on this cloth? There's no point going, I haven't really got time to go into all the details, but the one I want to find is the one I want to find is always the one that I can never find. Okay, it doesn't matter which slide it is, but it's always the one that somehow escapes. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. It's here somewhere, and if not, it'll be in the other one. Now, well, okay, I'll find it eventually. What it is was a forensic doctor from the University of Madrid and later on the University of Valencia, whose credentials, there it is, don't need presenting. He died now. He's been dead for a few years. He worked on various national murder cases. I mean, he's a forensic doctor. He decided, right, let's try and reproduce the stains that were made on this cloth. So he got this model head and actually made this, the fluid, you know, 1 part blood, human blood, 6 parts pleural edema fluid, and with this flow system and the angle system, reproduced the stains. Again, this is something, in order to be science, something has to be, you have to be able to reproduce it any number of times in a laboratory so that something will give you the same results every time. That, for example, is where any kind of resurrection theory about the shroud falls through. You can never prove it. You're never going to be able to resurrect a body in a laboratory and say this is science. This that's personal belief, okay, not science. Doesn't mean that they contradict each other. It just means that science cannot prove a resurrection. Okay, it can prove how stains were made on a cloth. And basically, summarizing, the only way to get these stains was, I've actually done this live a few times on Barry Schwartz, okay, when we've coincided at congresses. I've got a replica of the Sudarium, and I crucify Barry, and I have him standing there with his arms outstretched, as he's got long hair and a beard. Yeah.
He always
Then
makes the joke. Yeah,
that's
you're
also a
crucifying
fact
another Jew,
from the
right?
Sudarium. Everybody always shouts out, crucify him, crucify him. But we never have done yet. And the cloth was put round the head until it came to the right arm. Okay, now at this point, something made it impossible for the cloth to be put round the back of the head. So whoever put it on folded the cloth back over on itself. So that's why there are 4 different, the blood then seeped through the cloth coming out of the nose and mouth, and you've got 4 different sets of stains with a decreasing intensity. Obviously, the most intense one is the one that was in direct contact with the face that produced these stains. And as the liquid seeped through, then the stains became less intense. Okay. The body that produced these stains was left in an upright position with the arms outstretched, dead, because the stains are incompatible apparently with any kind of breathing movement, for between 45 minutes to 1 hour. Okay. The stains on the forehead that would correspond to the forehead on the cloth could only be made if the body in question was then lying face down on the floor, on the ground, okay, at a slight angle so that the feet were slightly higher than the head. Therefore, liquid coming out of the nose and mouth would, by gravity, not fall onto the ground, but, flow, if you like, very, very slowly down the face onto the forehead. Okay. And then the third set of movements was that this body was then carried with somebody holding the cloth to the nose and mouth of this dead body, face down. It was carried face down. That is how the different stains were produced. It's explained in great detail in all the rest of the slides. But again, like I say, you could be talking about this for 5 or 6 hours. That is what the cloth reveals in itself. Okay. I'm not going to say anything because we just don't know who that body belonged to, whose body it was. We don't know. We know the positions it was in when the stains were formed. Okay, and what the stains consist of. Up to there is something that can be and has been reproduced in the laboratory. And again, it doesn't matter what you believe, what you don't believe. Up to there, nobody said anything that says Christianity is true and everything else is wrong. No, nobody said that. These are just, that's how the stains were formed on the body. Now, can this be related to the shroud? Apparently it's the same blood group, AB, but there are some people who say that any ancient blood sample automatically degrades or converts into blood group AB. I have no idea who is right and who is wrong about that, because again, that's not the manuscript and it's outside my field of speciality. They're just the debates. The blood group coincides, and it's not a common blood group. Now, the main part here is, here's where I'm going to change to the other. No, the other part. No, just a second. 1 second. We'll just go back to the actual cloth itself. Now, the stains. Can you see my pointer, my marker on the screen? Yeah. Okay. These are the ones where the cloth was sort of folded around here on itself. The whole, by the way, was burnt by wax. That's from somebody holding a candle or incense over it. And if you look at it under a microscope, it's actually got burn marks on that hole. But the different set of stains are these ones over here. Okay, this, you can differentiate in a laboratory post-mortem blood, which does flow. There's this great myth that dead bodies don't bleed. They do. If you cut them, it's just that the flow is a lot slower, obviously because there's no heart beating to make the blood circulate. But if you cut a recently dead body, it will bleed. okay, just slowly. These stains over here consist of lifeblood, blood that was shed in life, okay, not post-mortem. And the way that the cloth was wrapped around the head, this part here would correspond to the nape of the neck, okay? Obviously, if that person had long hair, it wouldn't be against the skin, but against the, you know, this cloth would have been pinned to the hair, okay? There are pinholes that somebody would have put pins made of bone, no doubt, as pins were in the Roman world, small pieces of bone, to pin it to the hair, which was no doubt so matted with blood that it was like almost solid at that stage, okay? Now, now if we change over to the other one, that would correspond to these stains on the Shroud of Turin, which are from the back of the head, okay, corresponding to that same area. If you look at that one, the colors are irrelevant. That's just for the sake of an overlay. Okay?
Oh, that
obviously the blood stains on the shroud on the single neck are not green.
So
Okay.
sorry to interrupt, Mark. Are you
Yeah.
showing like because that's not showing up? We're just seeing like the Sudarium cloth. So
You probably got to stop sharing the first one and then share the second one.
yeah, because if you have something different up, we're not seeing it.
The overlay, yeah.
So
To a
just
certain extent, the shape of the blood does coincide. Again, it's
Well,
the
if-
eternal debate. You've got
if you click,
you know, you've got
stop.
people like Alan Adler,
so Mark, so
professional hematologist, great expert in blood, looked at this, saw the overlays and did everything and said that there is no way that these two cloths did not cover the same body.
can
Other
you
people will
stop?
say, well, you know, I can see stains here that don't correspond, therefore they didn't cover the same body.
Mark,
And
do you
there's no
mind-
easy answer to that argument. I think a lot of it, as so often happens in the world of shroud studies, is if you want to believe it, you believe it, and if you don't want to believe it, you don't believe it. Very difficult to actually reach an objective empirical truth in all of these studies, except for certain things like it's not a painting. Okay.
Mark, do you mind if you stop sharing? Because I
Yeah.
really want the audience to see what you're talking about with the overlay thing. Like, do you mind stop sharing and then re-share like the thing with the comparison? It was because I think that's really important for the audience. So
You want me to stop sharing this?
stop sharing and then click on share screen again and share the screen where you're talking about like the green and the, you know, the overlay type thing. You know what I mean?
We can only see the shroud, the Sudarium itself. We can't see the overlay pattern.
Oh, you can't? No, why not?
Yeah, that's
Well, so
I'm on it,
is it on the same PowerPoint that
but
like
I've moved on to it and I'm sharing it.
so can you unshare the first one?
Ah, okay. That's the one you can see,
Yeah,
yeah.
right? How do I
probably
unshare?
up at the top. It
Okay,
doesn't say.
okay, yeah. Right, but no, I don't think I'm sharing anything now.
That's
Now I
right.
have to go back to the other one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so click on share again and then make sure you click on the right.
Okay,
There,
There
there.
we
It-
go.
Yeah.
there it is. Well, yeah, okay. And if I go back to that first one there, can you see that? The one
Yeah.
of the shroud?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
That's the part of the shroud on the dorsal image that corresponds to the back of the head. Okay, so these are the stains that we're looking at. That's the two of them side by side. When I was talking about the colors, that's just done for the sake of the comparison. Obviously, the stains on the shroud are not green. Okay, that's obvious.
He's not a
okay?
Vulcan.
That's just for the sake
Mm.
of comparison. And the overlay looks like that, which convinces some people and doesn't convince others. Okay, as happens, like I say, with just about everything in shroud studies, the coins, the Wanger overlays, happens with, you know, so many things. If they did cover the same body, then you're talking, you know, the Sudarium has a very well established history, been in Spain since the 621, early 7th century. And it's been in Spain ever since, and the shroud has never been in Spain. So if they did coincide on the same body, it could only ever have been sometime before the 6th century, because there is a document from the 6th century that dates to 570, falsely attributed to a pilgrim called Antoninus, but it's actually anonymous, the document. We have no idea who wrote it. That's very common in the ancient world. Documents, I mean, it happens in the New Testament, you know, letters attributed to Paul that were not written by Paul. Commonplace in the ancient world. And we have this document from 570 explaining how the Sudarium was kept in a monastery next to the River Jordan, near Jerusalem. Okay, so it has been dated back to 570. There's another document that is just so controversial by a guy called Nonos of Panopolis, okay, who wrote paraphrase of John's Gospel. Some people say it was the 3rd century, some people say it was the 4th, some people say it was the 5th, some people say it was the 6th. Basically, we don't know. Happens a lot with obscure writers, okay? We don't even know who Nonos of Panopolis was. And he describes the Sudarium, which is mentioned in John's Gospel, by the way, in the 4th Gospel. You know, it does say that Jesus' body was covered first, the face was covered with a Sudarium, that was then taken off, and the body was covered with a full body shroud, okay? So it is mentioned in the 4th Gospel, not in the other 3, in the Synoptic Gospels, okay? But it is mentioned in the 4th. And he talks about the Sudarium being tied in a knot at the top of the head. And actually the crease marks in linen do actually suggest that this cloth was tied in a knot at the top of the head. That's coincidence, not evidence. Coincidence that points towards it being the same cloth, but cannot be taken as conclusive. Okay, so what I hope I've tried to do with this is explain what we do know definitely and how that could relate to the shroud. Okay. I always like to differentiate that. Science and history can take us to a certain point. Again, my opinion, and I reserve the right to be wrong. And from that point on, it can reaffirm your faith, it can bring you to faith, or it might not do anything related to faith. I love the situation, I was going to mention this before, that we had in the early 20th century, where you had the Jesuit priest Thurston arguing in the Catholic Encyclopedia that the shroud was a fake, result of superstition and medieval beliefs and everything like that. And at the same time, we had Yves Delage, a confessed agnostic in the French Academy, saying it was genuine. Which I just love. I love that situation. You've got your agnostic saying it's real. Why couldn't it? Why shouldn't it be? You don't have to be a Christian to acknowledge that the shroud touched the body of Jesus of Nazareth. And then you have a Jesuit priest saying, no, it's all superstition. I'm just going to turn the light on in this room because it's getting dark here now.
No problem. Awesome. All right. Yeah, well, that's a great, thank you so much for your opening presentation there. I appreciate it.
There's a lot more I could say about it, but you said try and keep it to within 10 minutes, and that's what I've tried to do.
Awesome. All right, cool. Yeah, and I want, before I go to the next panelist here, just one quick question for you, Mark, because I had Dr. Cesar Barda on my show before talking about the Sudarium, and he mentioned something about how there's half of a blood stain on the Sudarium and then the other half's on the shroud, and that's another way to link it. Are you familiar with
Sorry, I don't actually hear you very. I know I have hearing problems, but your voice is actually very low for me.
Oh, so is that better? Or
that's better, yeah. Even though now I can't see you, but at least I can hear you.
no problem. Sorry. So I was just asking you. I had Cesar Barda on the show, and he mentioned that on the Sudarium there's half of a blood stain, and then on the shroud is the other half, so they can kind of link the two cloths that way. So I was just wondering, do you know about that argument at all in terms of the link?
Half the blood stains. How do you mean?
So I can't remember. He was kind of saying like, oh, there's like a hole in the middle. It's like a donut or something, and then the course.
Yeah, I mean, just for example, again, that hole that I told you is definitely a burn hole. You know, because it's blackened edges around.
I remember
Sorry.
what it was.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Alan Wanger, with his famous Polaroid overlay technique, when he was in Oviedo, took a low quality photo of the cloth, and in something that he published on it said that hole was a blood stain when it's a hole, just because he was working from a low quality photograph. That's how easy it is to make mistakes.
Gotcha. I think Hugh knows what I'm talking about.
I remember what Cesar Bata was talking about. It was to do with a little spot which he thought was of blood in the same position.
Mouth. Yes, as the
teardrop
forehead.
above the eye.
Yes, yes.
He thought that the shroud shows a sort of more or less circular space with a clearer bit in the middle, and that clearer bit was the bit that was actually on the Sudarium, and he thought the two matched.
Yes.
I wasn't convinced myself, but that was what he thought.
I haven't had time to go into absolutely everything. I mean, I haven't even shown you any of the manuscripts showing all of that. But I mean, can you see that one?
Yeah.
That's one of them that just shows the route. If you look, it says ab urbe Hierosolima, from the city of Jerusalem, transtulit. They took it to Africa, from Africa to Carthage. Carthage in Spain, not Carthage of Hannibal. Okay, not in Africa. From Carthage to Toledo, from Toledo to Asturias. Asturias is the area in the north of Spain where Oviedo is, into the Church of the Holy Saviour, Sancti Salvatoris, in the place which is called Oviedo. Oveido, okay? That's just one example of one of the manuscripts. Like I say, the manuscripts are from different places, different times, and they all coincide. They differ as well. There are differences. They're not copies of each other, but the essential details are all the same, which from a historical point of view means that it's most probably that's what happened.
Awesome.
Again, and there's no problem admitting that. You don't have to be a believer. You don't have to be a Christian to accept that some people brought a cloth from Jerusalem to Spain and it's been there since the 7th century. Doesn't say anything at all about the essential truth of Christianity. But sometimes the debate is reduced to, you're a believer, you're not a believer. Therefore, everything's true or nothing is true. And it's not always like that. Okay.
Gotcha.
What I've tried to explain about the Sudarium is what should be and could be accepted by anybody because it's reproducible in a laboratory. The manuscripts are there for anybody to see who can read Latin.
All right, cool.
And again, that in history is an accepted principle. Multiple sources that agree on the essential truths most probably happened like that.
All right, cool. So I'm going to step in because I do want to make sure our other panelists get to speak about the Sudarium. So Bob, I'll start with you. Like, what's your take on the evidence from the Sudarium?
I've always just accepted that the Sudarium is a legitimate burial cloth from Jesus that was put over his head after he died on the cross to collect the blood that would have been coming out of the nose and the mouth, and that it was left on his body while the body was being taken down from the cross and transported to the tomb. The body was laid onto half of the body cloth, and then the person actually at the front of the stand-up or pit area in the tomb would have reached over and taken the Sudarium off the face and just dropped it onto the side bench, kind of even where his body was located. And so that becomes important actually in my work in the carbon dating of the shroud, to actually have a good estimate as to where the Sudarium was located actually in the tomb. It's probability argument.
Mm-hmm.
But
very accurate. Very accurate take of how that fits in with it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's a very accurate take of how that evidence that I presented fits in with the story of the death of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, so that there's no image on the Sudarium because the Sudarium had been taken off the body and laid aside. And then after that was taken off and laid aside, then the top side of the body cloth was laid across the body.
Yeah.
So it just seems to be consistent with the evidence that we see on the shroud and on the Sudarium. So yeah, so I accept both of them as being legitimate and authentic.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, cool. So Joe, I want to turn it to you. What's your take on the evidence from the Sudarium there?
I think based on the totality of the evidence, and we got people in Spain studying it pretty much exclusively, and you got people like well, besides Mark, you got Jackson and Adler, and even Rogers wrote about it. None of them discounted it. I think the evidence is very strong for the authenticity of the Sudarium. But I wanted to ask Mark if he could just speak to the carbon dating of the Sudarium and the dates that they got and his take on that.
Yeah, there was never okay, people argue about this. The cloth probably was dated, but the protocol wasn't followed, and there's no, and some people say, there's no hard evidence. It wasn't done in the right way.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar. But having said that, it probably was carbon dated, and the results came out as 8th century, which, again, we're lucky enough to know that the Sudarium is documented back to the 6th century. So obviously something went wrong with that. Or it's 300, the dating was, at least 300 years out, let's say, at least.
Yeah. So
it doesn't sort of coincide with its first historical mention by any means.
Yeah.
Historically, it existed before that, no matter what it is or what it isn't. If somebody comes along and said, I think it was made in the 4th century. Well, I would say, well, as far as the documents go, could be.
Cool. Yeah,
Bob, but not 8th century.
I see Bob wants to contribute on that before we go to Hugh. So yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah. So that in my work on the nuclear analysis of the Shroud of Turin, that the question, my concept for explaining the carbon dating of the corner of the shroud is that neutrons were emitted from the body, and they flooded the tomb, bouncing around in the limestone, eventually coming back after they've been thermalized, slowed down, and then absorbed in nitrogen in the Shroud of Turin to produce new carbon-14, which then can explain why the corner of the shroud dated to 1390 to 1260 to 1390.
Yeah.
And that concept explains the 4 different aspects of the carbon dating that need to be explained, and no other concept does. And that explains the date, the slope in the x direction and the length of the shroud, and in the y direction in the width of the shroud. And then I also recognize that it can explain a dating of the Sudarium to 700s or so, based upon the location of the Sudarium, a distance from the body cloth, so that the neutron distribution in the tomb fell off the further you would get from the body, so that the Sudarium was placed a distance from the body, so that there was less neutron absorption on the Sudarium to produce less carbon-14 on the Sudarium, so that that's why it didn't date to the same as the Shroud of Turin, but it was only changed from 33 AD to about 700 AD, because there was less new carbon-14 produced by neutron absorption on the Sudarium than on the Shroud of Turin.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, cool. Hugh, over to you. What's your take on the Sudarium evidence? And feel free to share your screen if you want.
Well, no, I'll just I'll repeat one comment of Mark's, but with reference to the shroud. and just ask one forensic clarification. So the repetition is that just as the shroud is mentioned dozens and dozens of times in history before 1350, but we can't be sure that those mentions actually refer to the Shroud of Turin. The fact that the Sudarium is mentioned several times in history doesn't necessarily mean that it must refer to the Sudarium of Oviedo, in my opinion. I think that we can only really be absolutely certain that the Sudarium of Oviedo traces back to about 1025 when the Holy Ark was opened. Would that be about right?
1075.
1075. Would you agree with that?
But Hugh, even then you've got no proof. I don't think there's any proof like we like to have it today until photography was invented and films where you actually take a photograph of something and say, right, this was here at this time.
That's fair enough.
Any object in history, archaeology, look at the debates about it. Manuscripts and mentions are as good as it gets for that time. I understand your reticence, and yes, you could argue that. I mean, you'll be limited to if you're saying that is something that is later and not necessarily those ones. It would have to be something made in Asturias in Oviedo, because that cloth has been there since that time.
Well, I think it probably came from
anything in history, and people do, you know, I mean, you take any account of anything in history and somebody will, you know, there'll always be opposing viewpoints on it, because we don't have the kind of evidence that we might
the forensic point is just something I'd like you to just clarify, and that is that you said that the blood definitely showed that it was or the blood stains definitely showed that they came from a man who had died with his arms outstretched.
Yeah.
Now, your diagram just had one arm, if I can remember correctly. Does it definitely prove that he had both arms outstretched?
Yes, with and the head at an angle of 70 degrees to one side, 30 degrees forward. That's how they are the results of how the stains were reproduced in the laboratory.
Well, they were reproduced with a single head. They didn't have arms.
Yes.
So what makes you think that the arms were outstretched?
It doesn't make me think. I can only repeat
what makes the forensic
doctor said.
That's to do with the blood
reasonings behind that. I really wouldn't know. Like I say,
that's right. It was just clarification.
You asked me about the manuscripts, and I can talk from here till midnight if you want. The rest of it, I rely on what other people have said. I don't understand the workings of it. I just know the results of what they've done. That's what I say. I mean, I can talk about what other people have said, but I don't know all the explanations and the reasons outside my own field.
Fair enough.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Well, one thing I just want to throw it open to the panel about like that link with the forensics and stuff. I know that's not anyone's area of specialization, but one thing that Hugh's kind of mentioned to me is, you know, that blood stain where you have the overlay technique. Hughes kind of said, but if you look at the two blood stains, it isn't in a precise match. It isn't an exact fit. But I think what you guys would say is there's a substantial fit where that's sufficient to say they must have covered the same corpse. Is that true? Or and
I agree. I think you can see it both ways. You know, some hematologists have argued that the two clots must have covered the same body, and others will say that you don't. This is like in the recent COVID crisis, at least in Spain. You know, one day you see an interview with a doctor in the newspaper, a qualified doctor saying that everybody should wear a mask everywhere, and the next day another equally qualified doctor says it's useless to wear a mask. You know, who do you believe in the end? I can only emit an opinion about what I think is right or wrong when it comes to manuscripts and history. The rest of it, like I say, I am just giving the results of what other people have done research on.
Gotcha.
Cesar Barta is not a forensic doctor either, by the way.
Okay.
He's one of those people who, and I tell him this to his face, I'm not bitching about him. He likes to think he's a historian, doctor, physicist, chemist, likes to think he's everything. Okay, I hope it's not false modesty, but I you know, like Hugh's question now, I don't know. I don't know what makes the forensic doctor think that. He did. I suppose it's written down somewhere and I should learn it, but I haven't actually seen that. It's the same as, I mean, the blood stains also apparently show, how do we know it was a man? Because he had a beard. He also had long hair.
Gotcha.
You can apparently extract that information from it too. Again, it's not surprising. Just because someone had a beard and long hair, you know, you're not saying any major truth about Christianity or about anything. Lots of people have beards and long hair. But again, so many people would then say, oh, you just want it to coincide with Jesus. And you're saying, no, I'm not saying that. Some people do, certainly. I'm not. I'm just saying that, you know, these experiments show that the person whose body this cloth was used on had a beard and long hair. That's it.
Gotcha. All right, cool. And yeah, I want to get the other panel. Like, what's your kind of take? And actually, if you want to stop sharing your screen, I can show you the picture that Hugh sent me, just so we can see.
That's my screen share of using screen grabs from Cesar Barter's book.
Yeah.
Okay,
so you're gonna show your own thing. Okay, cool. So
that's all. That just, to me, those don't coincide.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you have? Is that it?
Yep.
Okay. Do you mind stop sharing your screen? I just want to show.
I'm delighted. Yep. There we go.
All right. So I want to show.
I can understand that, Hugh. I can really understand that that reticence about that. It's not definite to my mind.
So yeah, so you guys can see, like, this is what he's kind of saying. We'll see, they're not precisely the same shape, but yeah, what would you guys say, like Bob and Joe and Hugh? We've heard Mark's case. Is this type thing sufficient enough to say, yeah, they probably covered the same corpse? Or yeah, like, well, Bob, we'll start with you, or Joe. So Joe, what's your take?
They're somewhat similar, but not exactly.
Okay, and is it similar enough in your view, or?
To be honest, I'm not sure.
Okay, Bob?
Yes, taking into account that, you know, this would be slightly different different claws that we're talking about. I think there's a reasonably good correlation between the two.
Cool. And Hugh, anything you wanted to say about that, or you've already said it?
No, nothing much. I would say that one should always consider the bits which don't coincide as well as the bits which do.
Yeah.
I think this was where Alan Wanger got things wrong with his sort of, however many you look up, 135 or 46 or 27, whatever he was, he compared things and he got these points of coincidence, but he sort of forgot all the points which didn't coincide. And I think that's quite important.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So yeah, I think I'll leave it open. Does anyone want to ask questions or engage with someone about the Sudarium, or do you think we cover it at all? Or
the one question I would have would be for Mark, and I was just wondering, is there some place on YouTube where we could look at your entire presentation on this?
Probably not on internet, but if you, let's see, Dale sent me an email, and I suppose you were copied in on it. I can send the presentation to you. Some of the slides are only in Spanish. I can send it to you by Dropbox or WeTransfer or something like that.
Yeah, so that would be very nice.
Yeah, I would like a copy of that too, please.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
Some of your blood overlays I hadn't seen before. I could just see them down the side, and I thought, oh, that'd be really interesting.
Okay, I'll send that by WeTransfer to everybody sometime soon. Okay.
And let me ask, would you mind? Is that a private thing, or could I post that on the blog? Your slides on the blogs? It's up to you.
Not the one that has the text in Spanish, because I don't have the copyright to that.
Okay.
Okay, that's the Spanish Center for Syndenology. I do have a second presentation, which is mainly based on the manuscripts, where I took all the photographs and do have permission to share that one.
Awesome.
Okay,
Cool.
I can send you both of them and tell you which one you can use publicly. I mean, when I say publicly, by publishing it on internet, and which one, is for private use or in a, private presentation or whatever, but not for publication.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. So look out for that. I'll also be posting up some links, Mark's books. He has about a 40-minute presentation over in the UK presenting to the Ahmadiyya Muslims, where he gives the full more of
Yeah, I went there once. He invited me, and I presented the Sudarium of Oviedo at the Ahmadiyya Muslim Congress near London. Must have been 2017. It was before the lockdown, 2017, 2018, something like that.
Yeah. So that was a good presentation there with the visuals. So, all right, cool. So yeah, with that said, if everyone's good to go, I just want to say thank you guys so much for coming on and giving these detailed presentations about these topics. I found it informative. Again, this is the point of the panels. I'm learning some new things and stuff like that, and updating based on what the experts have to say. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming on.
No, been a pleasure. Anytime
Thank you.
want, I'll be back.
Good to see.
Thank you
Good to
all
see
for
everybody.
putting up the skeptic again.
Yeah, well, you are, I will have to say, Hugh, you are invaluable as the Shroud skeptic, because a lot of
Hugh, it's essential to have, in any debate, it's essential to have both sides of the argument presented. Otherwise, you're just preaching to the converted,
and I will
which can be interesting for some people, but it's too easy.
Yeah, and I will say I do give Hugh credit for that because I've tried with other Shroud skeptics. The pro Shroud guys, they're willing to step up to the plate and share stuff, but I've tried with multiple Shroud skeptics. Hugh's the only one who's been willing to debate and won. So yeah, great. So with that said, that should be it for just so the audience knows what I have coming up next week. So I'm going to be having Travis Lee Worth and Omar Fakuri back on. So Omar was the former Hindu who is actually convinced by the Shroud evidence in some of our Shroud shows. So he's got an interest in Christianity, but we're going to be talking specifically about his problems with the book of Genesis, the creation versus evolution debate and the flood. So, Travis is an expert from the Reasons to Believe with Dr. Hugh Ross and Dr. Fuzz Rana. So we're going to be debating that. But other than that, have a great week.
Okay, great. You too.
Thanks,
Nice
Dale.
to speak to you, everyone. Okay.
Nice to see everybody.